Hi, well, hello. My name is Wendy Kozlowski. I'm sorry you have to hear me talk so much today. This is collaboration at one level up. This is a talk to introduce you to the Data Curation Network, which is an effort to share expertise across institutions, not even within institutions. To give you a little bit of background about how the Data Curation Network started, I mentioned in Sarah's talk, she mentioned that in 2010, the National Science Foundation started this requirement for data management plans. And this was a significant change in the United States. The National Institutes of Health had required people to share their data since 2002. But they didn't actually enforce the writing of a data management plan in their proposals. So this sent people into a little bit of a tailspin in the United States. People were confused about how they were going to actually do it, and libraries identified this as an opportunity for us to support our researchers. So of course, what did libraries do? We made online guides. This is an example of Purdue University's online guide that was how to support data management plans. In that last deck, I showed you what our guide currently looks like. And unfortunately, the internet, I went to get a picture of Cornell's guide, and the Internet Archive did not scrape it. So our original 2010 guide is lost. Some archivist I am. The library started saying, hey, this is a place we can help. We are information managers. So we should be able to help our researchers manage their information. However, there wasn't a lot of workflows or actually well-defined guidance around data management planning at the time. So even though libraries knew we were inherently good at it, we still had to create the content. But of course, I think it's a little bit of an aside. As a researcher, starting as a biologist, one of my biggest concerns when I came to the library was, I'm not going to do research anymore. Now I'm a librarian, I don't get to do research. But that's not true. Librarians ask a lot of questions, and in order to do our work well, we ground it in research also. And again, out of Jake Carlson's work, out of Purdue University Library, a group of librarians developed a tool that allowed us to gather information from our faculty about what data services and data curation needs they have. So the toolkit is still available online. There's an output. The second link is a list to all the universities that use this set of questionnaires with their faculty, including Cornell University's, which is at the bottom link. So it allowed us to gather information formally from our faculty on what their needs might be. And this is the same time when groups like the Research Data Management Service Group, the original iteration of CDS, came into being, right? This is 2010, 2011. And this is some screenshots from a very early version of our website. It is also when many research data repositories started popping up. This is a screenshot from the University of Minnesota. And I did this just because you're going to see screenshots from Cornell all afternoon, so I'm going to put some other institutions in here too. And University of Minnesota really was a leader in this area. But we identified the need that we didn't want the data that got put into these data repositories to just be a dump. We didn't want someone to say, okay, I have to have my data in the next 3 hours, so I'm just going to put a big pile of folders in a space and turn it on and make it public. There's a risk there, right? What if they put information there that shouldn't have been public? What if someone needed to reuse it? Would they be able to understand it? So the libraries identified the need that we didn't want to just create a repository where anyone could go and put anything. We needed to curate the data. And in order to do that, we had to invest staff time and energy into looking at that data, the documentation and connections between files, because that is what makes the content in our repository valuable. However, just like data management planning, we didn't know a whole lot about data curation yet and what it took. I want to give massive credits to Lisa Johnston, who was originally at the University of Minnesota. She now is at the University of Wisconsin. She did a lot of seminal work researching data curation as a concept and looking at what practices were going on and how to come up with practical strategies for how to actually curate data. These are a couple of books that she edited that contain information about very deep level how to curate. Then she went on and she did a pilot test at the University of Minnesota where she had a data set that she had her librarians go in and look at and review and told them to try to curate the data. And it really surfaced some interesting insights about what we need to be able to do as curators in order to get this data prepared for sharing. So that was a lot of talking again. Really what I said in those last few slides is that librarians have skills and expertise needed for preservation and sharing. It's kind of what we do. But we needed to be able to translate those skills to what the researchers needed with their research data. And we wanted to be able to leverage existing library and archival practices to make curation work, not just a concept, but move it into this idea of how we actually do it. I showed you screenshots from a number of different institutions. There were a lot of us thinking about this at this time. And do you know the term silos? Like working in isolation with one another? That's kind of how we were feeling at the time. We needed to be able to think about this not by ourselves. We needed to be able to not everyone inventing the wheel at their own institutions. So we wanted to break down the barriers to allow librarians to talk across institutions and share our experiences and skills, much like what we do within our institutions through groups like CDS. We also wanted to develop some shared common practices. Our researchers don't stay at a single institution their whole career. Someone at Cornell will end up, I hate to say this, but they'll probably go to Harvard. But they need to have the same practices, or at least familiar practices, regardless of where they work. So that was our goal. And thus, the Data Curation Network was born. It literally happened over burritos and margaritas at a Mexican restaurant at a conference. And it is absolutely wonderful that we are able to come together virtually like we do at seminars like this. But there is something about us being in person that stimulates these ideas and conversation. And I remember sitting at this restaurant table and saying, what if we could just give you a data set? And because I don't know how to curate medical images, what if I was able to give it to you at Washington University, because they have a medical school also. And literally, that's how the idea of sharing our expertise was born. There were 6 of us that worked together to try to break down these silos. We applied for a 1-year pilot program with the Alfred Sloan Foundation, which is a private funder in the United States. And we got that grant to investigate what a shared network of expertise might look like. We wanted to understand what curation workflows might be. We wanted to look at how it might be staffed and governed. We wanted to look at what financial stability looks like. How do you sustain resources for a network like this? And then how do we sustain it over time? The pilot program specifically was tasked with having a roadmap for how to do this once a grant was to run out. And all of this was rooted in this idea that we called radical interdependence, radical independence. Oh, that's typed wrong. It's supposed to be radical interdependence. My apologies, I'll fix that. Change that in your slides, interdependence, which is something we have tried really hard to maintain in the DCN. It is about relying on one another to work together to find common solutions and address common challenges. We wanted to go beyond just sharing information and actually do the work together of curating data. We didn't want to say, I don't know how to help you. We wanted to be able to say, I have a colleague who can help you, and that colleague can help me complete my work. This is a timeline from the very early days of the Data Curation Network, just to give you an idea of how we started and how we grew. I mentioned that we had a 1-year grant, that was 2016. That moved into a 2-year grant, also from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, where we were tasked with actually taking what we learned in that pilot and putting it into action. And by the end of those 2 years, be ready to function without any external funding. What that 2-year grant did allow us to do was hire a director. So we were able to use funding from the grant to have a full-time person help us think about and launch this shared curation workflow. It was officially launched in January of 2019, and we, by 2021, transitioned to being member supported. So no more grant support, but member institutions paying in order to support the network. I said that we started with 6 institutions. We grew by 2 institutions each year, and now in 2025, we have 25 member institutions in the Data Curation Network. The ones marked with red asterisks are the 6 original institutions, but here also are the other current sustaining members of the Data Curation Network. Just like my picture of all the faces in the CDS slides, here are some of the people that underlie the Data Curation Network. We are really about being a community of curators. We are data stewards, we are data practitioners, and we share our knowledge and our time in order to collaboratively curate our research outputs. and work to advance data curation as a profession. And I'll get into that a little bit more. There are 5 main areas that DCN focuses on. The first one is obvious. We are here to curate and make data sets more fair. But we also have put in our mission an obligation to teach, to instruct people who want to become data curators, and to instruct researchers themselves if they want to do that curation themselves, become better data managers. In order to do that, we have created a set of documents that we call primers, and these are written instructions based on different kinds of file types or disciplines with lists of actions that you do to curate those data sets. We also have put into our mission an interest in research. Like I said, librarians do like to do a lot of research. I was so relieved. We have special interest groups that have gone out and gotten additional grants to do particular work related to topics like human subjects research, like the costs of research data sharing, like how we can make our metadata more improvable or more findable across institutions. We have lots of special interest groups that talk about specific things like big data and how we work with big data, how we work with human subjects. We've done a lot of research into trying to be more aware and responsive to racial justice issues. And I already mentioned that we are a community. We are a network of people who depend and trust one another to do this work. So this is, remember that chart I made of CDS? Here's the equivalent chart of DCN. The DCN has a governance board, and that is a representative from each of the paying member institutions that sits on the governance board. Alongside it, we have an advisory board. These are people also from member institutions, but usually one higher up. So these would be like our assistant university librarians, or even a few university librarians sit on our advisory board. The governance board has voting rights for when we make decisions. And then below this, we have our DCN members that can choose to be members of different committees if they want. And some of those committees are also open to people who are not members of the DCN. So for example, I chair the big data interest group, and you don't have to be a member of the DCN to come to the events that are hosted by the big data interest group. So we have community, members, and governance above that. This is a quick look at the actual curation piece of how we ingest files into the system. So a researcher hands their data set to a repository manager, and that person says, I have no clue how to do this data set, or I'm going on vacation tomorrow and I need someone to help me. So that repository or that curator can submit the data set to the Data Curation Network. And we have another ticketing system that we do that with. So the director or the coordinator of the DCN receives that data set and says, okay, Cornell, I acknowledge that you can't do this. It's good, we can handle it at the DCN. I know that there is someone at the University of Arizona that can handle this kind of data. And so that person reaches out to the curator in a member institution, and that curator says, yeah, I have the time, I can help with this data set. And they go through and do the actual curation process. They look at the files. They don't interact with the researcher. That coordinator from Arizona writes back to me and says, here's what I found, Wendy. Why don't you ask these questions? And I think that would make this data set better. So we still maintain the relationship with our researchers. As a curator, I still work with my faculty member. That faculty member, I tell them that I'm working with a colleague, but they don't interact with the colleague in Arizona. I still get to develop that relationship with that faculty member, and that's very important. So it gets assigned, the curator from the other institution does the curation, and it goes back to me at my local institution. And if it needs to go around that circle on the right again, it can. But usually you get feedback from your DCN coordinator, and my data set still goes into my repository at Cornell better than it would have if I hadn't sent it to the DCN. The top part of this slide is pretty much the same as what I just described to you in that other diagram. But what I want to highlight is the workflow that's at the bottom, this curator workflow. So once whoever is going to curate the data gets it, we all do the same set of steps to look at those files. So again, we want to know that if I give this data set to that Arizona curator, they would do the same kind of work I would do if I was curating it. So this is this mutual set of expectations. So we love our acronyms, and we actually managed to make the curation process fit the word curate. And then we added a D at the end where we document everything we do and after the curation process. So every curator that is in the DCN follows this same set of steps, and that builds trust. And we are curating data sets. So the green data sets are ones that have been completed and curated over the years. The blue are ones that are actively in curation right now. And you can see we've been steadily climbing over time. But in actuality, so this is about 500 data sets curated by what we have now in the network, which is about 80 curators. And at first that slope looks pretty steep, but in reality, that's not nearly as many data sets as we thought we would have. That's 25 institutions and only 500 data sets in 6 years. In reality, we're not giving each other a lot of data sets. Cornell, for example, submitted 3 data sets to the Data Curation Network last year. We curated 3 from other institutions, but we only gave 3. So what we're finding is that institutions are getting better and getting more resources to curate the data themselves. So what we built this network to do, shared curation, hasn't been why people are joining. I mentioned that we're up to 25 members. We're in the process of adding another member right now. Institutions still want to be a part of the DCN, and we're doing a little bit of curation. But what we've discovered that the DCN is about is community. It's about having a safe place to learn from one another and to say, I want to do this. Has anybody else tried? And you have this trusted community where you can go to one another. And many of us get that in other places professionally, but there's something different about the DCN and this rapport that we have built with one another because we all do the same thing. And because it's very focused not on the entire life cycle of research data services, but very much on curating data sets to make them more fair for sharing. So our scope is very small, and it keeps us focused on that one topic, and I think that really helps with our community. I just wanted you to have the link to the primers. I mentioned those primers earlier. We are now up to 46 different data curation primer topics. Those might be of interest to any of you who are actively curating data. And they are archived at the University of Minnesota Institutional Repository, but there are also live versions of them available on GitHub. Another success that I think the DCN has had, as I mentioned, was education. Part of that original grant that we got from the Sloan Foundation allowed us to offer curator training sessions. Since 2017, we've held 17 DCN curator trainings, and I actually did a count of how many people. Hundreds of people have gone through our DCN trainings. And so again, that feeds back into that cycle of maybe why we're not asking one another to curate as much, because the skill set of our curators at our institutions are growing. And we have provided things like these checklists that go through those curated steps for anyone who goes through these trainings. And they're actually online and publicly available too. This is trying to remind me to mention again the research that the DCN does. So in addition to education, we have decided that part of our responsibility as curators is to continue learning ourselves. So we've had a number of different projects that we have done early on. When we were developing the DCN, we pulled together focus groups at each of those founding 6 institutions, and we asked, what is it the faculty feel that they need when it comes to data curation? And the number one thing that faculty identified back in 2016 was they need help with documentation. So that was something we knew we could work on as curators, for example. We went on beyond those 6 institutions and asked a similar set of questions to a number of libraries that are a part of the Association of Research Libraries in the United States. And I think we also interviewed Canadian research libraries and wrote an article, it's called a spec kit, about data curation needs in 2017, so even broader than the DCN member institutions, identifying where people need help. We were also really curious about whether or not what we did mattered. Imagine that. So we did a research project on, we got funding from the National Science Foundation. No, this was IMLS, sorry, the Institute of Museum and Library Sciences in the United States funded a project on the value of curation. And we interviewed repository staff to find out their perspective on whether they thought their work was worthwhile. Over 91% agreed that the curation done in their repository added value to the data sharing process, and that value was vastly worth the investment and the time. Over 85% said it was worth the effort. I'm going to read to you this quote from a respondent from the survey that said, "Direct communication with the author creates a solid relationship and therefore allows the library to work with them on other data management needs. We can improve their data workflows using a real example, and their data is better organized and described the next time they put the data or they deposit data to our repository." So just like training curators makes the need for shared curation less, the more we work with our faculty, the better they get at submitting data, and the less we have to do in the curation process to get them to be ready. But you might say, well, you're asking repository managers, of course they're going to say that their job is important. So we also did a survey of researchers to find out whether they felt the process of curation added value. And still, 97% agreed that the process of data curation added value to the data sharing process, and 96% said that it was worth the effort. Really interestingly, a vast majority, 90%, felt more confident sharing their data because they went through the data curation process. And again, documentation and general review were the two things that our researchers said the curation process helped them the most with. Both this study and the one from the previous slides are written up. We published papers in PLOS, and the links are in these slides if you want to see a little bit more about that work. We did get a National Science Foundation grant to look at what we called the realities of academic data sharing, where we wanted to look at where people are funding, or where people are sharing their data, and how good is the metadata that's underlying that? How do researchers make decisions about sharing, and both how and where? And how much does it cost our institutions to support this? Those are three main goals of that RADS project. And there's more information that I can share here, so I'm just going to highlight one thing. These were the 6 institutions that were a part of that RADS project, and we looked at data site DOIs from funded projects from our institutions and tried to look at where people were sharing. And, you know, as an institutional repository person, I was like, they've got to be putting them in institutional repositories, but they're not. They're putting them in generalist repositories. Have any of you heard of Zenodo? Zenodo is a repository run out of CERN, and it is easy to access. It is fast. They don't curate the data that goes into Zenodo. Remember I talked about being concerned that people would just dump their data and it be a mess? Zenodo, they can do that in, and that is where the vast majority of our researchers across all of our institutions are putting their research data. So there's still work to be done. Cornell University just this week launched a pilot where we offer curation services for data sets going into Zenodo now. I'll let you know how that goes. This is a quick look. One of those questions talked about metadata. We are really curious, how are we doing across our institutions at describing our records? And you can see, I realize this is a little bit of confusing. Each colored line is a different institution, and each point across the bottom axes is a metadata element. And you can see there are really only 2 elements that all of our institutions are uniformly filling out. We're putting what year the publication came out, and we're putting an author name on them. It's pretty embarrassing as librarians, really, how little universal metadata we're putting into those DOIs. However, this was great motivation for us to think about how we're populating the information in these data site records. And I know that Cornell University, because of this study, was a real eye-opener, and we now make much more complete records. So if you were to look at Cornell University's plot of this now, our records are much more complete when it comes to filling out our DOIs. So this one had a very practical outcome for us. So we've accomplished a lot of really good things, but there are a lot of more challenges that we haven't been able to address, and a lot more work to be done. We really see ourselves in this ongoing development phase, as you can see in the center of this community cultivation life cycle image. And that basically says, even when you have an organization running and a community started, it doesn't self-maintain. You actually need to actively go in and ensure that you're meeting changing needs of the community. We are really fortunate in the DCN. We've continued to be financially sustained by our member institutions, and we have a very active and vibrant community with our curators. For example, we identified the need, even especially after COVID, when people are going to fewer meetings, to bring people together that aren't part of the DCN and talk about some of the needs and what's happening with data sharing at our institutions. So late last year, we pulled together 100 people from 33 institutions over the course of 2 days to talk about building a community of practice around data curation. And we identified things like what needs do we have related to training, consultation, education, what technologies or metadata are you using, what repository platforms, is there a group that could be gathered, all the institutions that are using the same technologies. And then we talked about how to build community outside our members, across institutions and like CDS within institutions. And we had some great conversations with people that participated in this. And we got excellent feedback saying we need more of these kinds of sessions. And the DCN is going to try to continue to hold more of these kind of community sessions. However, we still have challenges. One challenge that is something that's very important for us to address is that those 25 member institutions are all big research institutions in the United States. We all look very much alike. And we all are, even with budget cuts, relatively well-resourced, both with staffing and with finances. How can we make a network like the DCN attractive to smaller institutions who might not be as well-resourced as we are, who might not have curators or even repositories in-house? We need to find ways to be more welcoming and more inclusive, and acknowledge that change is always happening. For example, right now, the Data Curation Network is searching for a new director. And that person is so involved in what and how we do our work that it's hard to think that that person won't bring some sort of change to the DCN, and we need to be resilient enough to manage that change. We need to be aware of our capacity, and we need to remember that that radical interdependence is core to the Data Curation Network. We know that trust is important, and it comes as a benefit to the DCN, and we need to be careful that we maintain that trust as we grow. And I think that's a real question for us. How well can a community stay together, aligned, and trusted when it gets really big? It's really easy to have 3 good friends. It's hard to have 100 really good friends. And I think that's true in a network like this too. So those are things that the DCN wants to think about as we move forward. If you're interested in learning more about the DCN, many of these slides actually come from a report that a few of us got together and wrote in a retrospective report of what the DCN has done over the years. This is available online. The DOI is in the slide deck. And to wrap it up, it's been a bit of a long journey, but I think that we have created a successful cross-institutional collaboration. We have been vulnerable, but we have built trust. And we have a strength in our resources. Many of us are facing similar challenges, the same here as in the United States. And we need to remember that we don't have to go through those things alone. So thank you very much for listening to me again. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
レンディさん、大変ありがとうございました。DCN のネットワークについて、信頼できる関係性っていうところが大変心に残りました。